Hello and welcome to Lexitecture, a podcast about word origins and histories. My name is Ryan, and in each episode my friend Amy and I bring a new pair of words to share their stories with each other and you. You can find our past episodes and the occasional blog post on our website at lexitecture.com. Follow along with us on Twitter and Facebook at Lexitecture, and if you really like what we do, you can support the show at patreon.com/lexitecture. Today's episode, Plague Farm. Should we do some words?
We should, pictures of puppies, please, or the wordy equivalent.
The wordy equivalent, okay. Would you like to go first, or would you like me to?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. You're probably going to laugh at me a little bit here, but that's okay. I can take it.
Okay.
So, the word I'm going to talk about today is plague. For fairly obvious reasons.
Yeah, what brought that to mind?
Exactly as you've been talking about, the Black Death, the various plagues well, it's interesting, we tend to think of plague as in the bubonic plague, which blighted large parts of Europe in the Middle Ages and perhaps before, because who knows, if people weren't keeping score.
Yeah.
We don't get to know about these things, exactly as you said. And of course, I think that it's fair to say that there have been other plagues, because the word is used generically to describe diseases, diseases that spread quickly. Yeah. And I thought it would be interesting to have a little look at it, particularly given that plagues are old,
Yeah.
They've been happening for hundreds upon hundreds of years. So I thought it would be cool to see what a word that's been presumably used for as long as that might have to say to us.
Absolutely.
So I started with the OED, as I usually do. And here's what the OED has to say. We have plague, noun. The etymology from classical Latin plaga, stroke or wound. And in post-classical Latin, affliction, illness, plague, especially one interpreted as divine punishment. It's quite interesting. Mm-hmm. And probably subsequently reinforced by Middle French plague or plague, as we would spell it now. We have to compare Middle Dutch plague or plage, wound, divine affliction, torture, coming from the Dutch plague, meaning vexation or nuisance. Interesting to go from a thing that kills you sent by God to, annoying.
A nuisance, yeah.
Yeah, we then get Middle Low German plague, meaning vexation or suffering or an infectious disease, divine affliction. And we go through all these Germanic, Middle High German, Old Icelandic, Old Swedish, generally having this sense of, a pretty stable sense of meaning.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in the OED, the noun form is older than the verb form. And the first definition given for the noun is obsolete. Because originally, and by originally I mean around about 1382, a plague was a blow, or a smiting, or a slaughter.
Oh.
So the earliest citation is from a Wycliffite Bible. The
Right.
Lord to broside the staff of iniquitous men, betting populace of indignation with an inhalable plague.
Jeez.
And then we go on to around about 1384, again from another Wycliffite Bible. They break into Gedra and smitten him with great plague. So a plague was something that struck you, literally a blow. And interesting to come through that literal into figurative sense that we so often see, particularly when nouns turn into verbs, but also as usage kind of. Well, I tend to think of the etymology of words as being a little bit like a virus. It starts somewhere and then it gets picked up. And as it gets picked up, it changes. Yeah. And as it's used in different ways, people interpret it in different ways. So we start off with a blow from 1382. And we also get the sense of a wound easy to see that a wound would come from a blow, and then becoming a wound, a sore, or a boil. Apparently still used in Caribbean English, but dating back from that 1382. A man in was skein and flesh were sprung in diverse colour or blain, that is to say, a plague. Of lepra he shall be brought forth to Aaron. So, a sore, a boil, or an oozy, unpleasant thing you don't want to have about yourself. And then we get to dating from around about the same time, but given as a second meaning within the OED, a particular affliction, calamity, or evil, especially one interpreted as a sign of divine anger or justice, or as divine punishment or retribution. And that's usually with reference to the 10 plagues of Egypt, described in Exodus chapter 7 to 12. So, a thing that strikes you, getting us to a wound, or a sore, or a boil, because, of course, one of those things could quickly become the other. Being struck could lead to a wound, a sore, or a boil, which then becomes more generally an affliction.
Right.
And we get kind of, this sense that it's God who's hitting you. Which is quite interesting. We then get sense 3, a sporadic disease or disorder, especially with specified kind. And this is an obsolete use. And it strikes me that this is, we have around about 1425 in this first sense, 1526, 1611, 1672, up until 1886. I think, before medical science was much of a science, and illnesses were illnesses rather than specific, scientifically defined infections or viruses or whatever they were. So, before people knew what caused specific illnesses, everything must have seemed like a plague. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And then we get to sense 3b, any infectious disease which spreads rapidly and has a high mortality rate, an epidemic of such a disease. And it says here, in early use, it's difficult to distinguish that from sense 3c, which is an infectious disease characterised by high fever, initial involvement usually of lymph nodes or the lungs, hemorrhage and shock, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, chiefly transmitted to humans from rodents or other mammals by fleas, and occurring in isolated cases, small outbreaks and major pandemics, an outbreak or occurrence of this. Now, this is the plague.
Yeah.
And the OED goes on to say it's difficult to distinguish that from the sense of the plague being an infectious, fast-spreading disease.
Right.
But it also goes on to point out that we have the bubonic plague, in which buboes are formed, usually in the inguinal lymph nodes, and pneumonic plague, in which there is primary involvement of the lungs. And I love the word bubo. There's an absolutely wonderful TED talk by a guy called James, whose name was in my head until I started this sentence.
Oh, I hate that.
I'll look it up. It's one of my most favourites. It's about metaphor.
Okay.
And it was the first time I ever saw anyone using, oh my God, my brain is letting me down.
Oh no.
A particular kind of presentation software that I used for a bit that's really, really cool.
Prezi? PowerPoint?
Yes, thank you, Prezi.
Yeah, okay.
It was the first time I'd ever seen Prezi. And this guy talks about metaphor and he talks about language, and it's a really, really interesting TED talk. I highly recommend checking it out. But he talks about the bubo-kiki test. Have you seen this? You heard of this before?
No.
And basically what this suggests is bubo and kiki are these two words that are accompanied by two pictures. And one of the pictures looks like a sort of a curvy-edged cartoon jellyfish kind of splodge.
Okay.
And the other one has spikes rather than curves. Okay. And the test is about the fact that most people will associate the curvy shape with bubo because it sounds curvy, and the spiky shape with kiki because it sounds spiky.
It does sound spiky.
Which is kind of interesting. And I always sort of think that bubo, it's it's curvy and it's quite mellifluous and it's nice to listen to. And then if you know anything about the plague and you know about buboes, not fucking funny.
No, yeah, it becomes less cute pretty quick.
Yes, much, much less cute. Anyway, I digress.
James Geary.
Thank you, James Geary. It's a wonderful, wonderful TED Talk. I really, really recommend it.
It's called Metaphorically Speaking, for anyone who's still going, just tell us what it's called. I just looked it up.
Yeah.
I found
Thank
it.
you.
I will watch it later.
What a team. So we then get Sense 3D, meaning to avoid or to shun someone like the plague. To avoid someone at all costs or to shun them completely. And we get this from 1699. Interesting, I thought, because I presume that in the early days of pestilence and disease, people just didn't know what caused disease to spread.
Yeah.
So this social distancing thing that we're currently going through, I did read, I saw a post on Reddit about a village that cordoned itself off from everywhere else. It literally drew a line around its boundaries and wouldn't allow anyone to cross in or out. And most people died of the plague. It was a Black Death scenario. Most people died, but they didn't spread any further cases. And at that time, that must have been really quite revolutionary. For people to say, hang on, we feel like if you get close to people, then you might catch this. And, early kind of epidemiology beginning to kind of be around and be used by people. Because obviously if the plague kills everyone, you want to try and avoid it. And that then leads us to this sense of avoiding people, avoiding everybody, avoiding, situations and places where a disease is likely to be contracted.
Yeah.
We then get the more general sense.
Late as end of 1600s did strike me as sort of late, but it makes sense that you see the plague doctor costume with the bird beak, where they would put all the lavender and garlic and nice, or at the very least strong smelling stuff, because it was the stink that got you with the plague, according to so it didn't have anything to do with distance. As long as what you were smelling was nice, you weren't going to get sick.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, we have, of course, we're very much hitting up hard against first citation in writing versus usage.
Right.
Very, very difficult when you're talking about a word that's as infectious as this one, dare I say, and also that has so many different contexts.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
So we then get to the extended use of a person, animal or plant whose presence, behaviour or activities are damaging, troublesome or in a weakened use merely irritating. Interesting that we get back to that, we kind of go full circle to a weakened sense that means the same as the etymology, the etymological sense did in certainly in some of those Germanic languages.
Yeah.
And a large number of particular people, animals or plants seen as a threat or as a cause of trouble. So, a person could be a plague, a general plague, or a large number of people being a plague. And then again, something which causes constant, incessant, or overwhelming trouble or annoyance, trouble, nuisance, or difficulty. And there are thousands of compound usages for the plague. I'm not going to get into that. But as when you go to OED, it gives you both the entry, but it also shows you the entries around about it, before and after. And I'm looking at a whole page of plague.
Wow.
So, there's a whole lot of compound usages. So, in terms of etymology, we have this sense of coming from classical Latin into English and all of these other Germanic senses, which made me wonder, of course, might I smell some pie?
Ooh.
And I'm delighted to say that we do indeed have a pie root that is believed to be the source of the word plague. So Etym Online says this: late 14th century, plague, affliction, calamity, evil, scourge, as we've discussed. And then we get to early 15th century, malignant disease. And we come through, so Latin plaga, used in Vulgate for pestilence, meaning stroke, and probably from the root of plangere, to strike or to lament by beating the breast. Interesting. I think that however your etymological journey goes with this word, the striking is very, very quickly related to that being not just a bad thing, but a really terrible thing.
Yeah.
And then we get Greek, Doric Greek plaga, meaning blow. And this all comes from the Pi root plak, P-L-A-K, meaning to strike. So if we have a look at this, there's actually two senses for the same root. I found that very interesting. I don't really know enough about Proto-Indo-European, more on that in a minute, but I don't really know enough about Proto-Indo-European to know if these would have come themselves from a further route, like an earlier route, or if they've just diverged in a kind of a natural sort of sense, or if they have diverged in an etymological sense, that one is related to the other. So I was interested to find that plaque, the first sense given for this Proto-Indo-European root is to be flat, which is an extension of another root, pele, which means to spread. Now, of course, my little folk etymological heart skipped a beat and jumped up and down at the thought that a blow that spreads might be somewhere implicated in the etymology of this word.
Yeah.
Because what else is a plague other than a thing that strikes you down, that spreads, that goes all over the place?
Yeah.
So this root pele, which eventually, again, has two different meanings, sorry. So we have to fill with derivatives referring to abundance and multitude, things like plentitude and plenty, and anything that uses that prefix polyglot or polyhedron.
Okay. Yeah.
And lots of other cognates. And then we get the second meaning flat or to spread. It forms all or part of airplane, dysplasia, ectoplasm, effleurage, esplanade, explain, feldspar field, flaneur, floor, lano, palm, as in the flat of the hand, and palm, as in tropical tree.
Right.
Palme, pianoforte, plasma, plasmid. There are lots. I'm selecting here.
Wow.
And it's the hypothetical source of, or the evidence for its existence is provided by Greek plasein, to mould, plasma, which is something moulded or created, and Latin planus, meaning flat, level, even, plain, or clear. So a flat thing that, a spread out thing, which gets us to the sense plaque, meaning to be flat, which gives us words like flag, flake, as in a thin flat piece, flaw, a fluke, which is a flatfish, placenta, plagal, plagiarism, planchet, and plank. So perhaps more that sense of spreading out to make something flat rather than my folk etymological clutching at straws, things that are spread out like diseases are. But the second sense of this word, plaque, meaning to strike, it gives us cognates such as apoplexy, complain, fling, paraplegia, plaint, plangent, plankton, planksty, plague, plectrum, and quadriplegia. Interesting plectrum, because a plectrum both strikes and is flat. So I found that quite pleasing.
I don't know what a plectrum is.
What? Oh, of course. You're a drummer. A plectrum is that little flat piece of plastic that some guitarists use to strike the strings.
Like a pick?
Yeah.
It's called a plectrum?
Yeah. You've never heard the word plectrum before?
I've literally never in my entire life heard the word plectrum before.
Oh, it's so much more pleasing than pick.
I use one all the time, but
it's one of these words that it's like a secret onomatopoeia, I think, plectrum.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
wow.
I love it. It's also an object that I very much associate with my dad, because my dad played the guitar and he hoarded plectra, possibly, like they were made out of solid diamond. Because, you know yourself, they go missing all the time.
All the time.
So, like, you would say, Dad, do you have a plectrum? And he would be like, no. You're like, Dad, clearly you have 15. Will you lend me one? I don't have any. There are no plectrums here. No.
Yeah.
He always had a plectrum.
Always.
But, yeah. Oh, interesting that you've never heard that word before. Anyway, in my investigations, I feel like this is a bit of a long one. In my investigations regarding the sense of, well, Proto-Indo-European roots that have more than one meaning, how does that all kind of work out? I found a really, really interesting resource. I don't know if it's a resource yet. I haven't quite decided.
Okay.
Good old Google took me to a document called. I believe there are 5 of these documents, all in all. But the one I'm looking at the moment is called 1200 Pi Roots Deciphered, brackets, the source code 2.2.
Ooh.
Now, yeah, this is exciting, isn't it?
Yes, I like.
We read things like that and we're like, oh, what is this?
That sounds fantastic.
So the document comes from a site called academia.edu, which I had never seen before. And then it turned out I had totally seen it before because apparently they have an app and I used to have the app on my phone. And it gives you, it's one of these, there's a free service, there's a paid service. It gives you access to academic articles, journals, things like that. However, the author of this document, Fernando Villamor, it's just all kinds of interesting because he does that thing that we encountered so much at Sound Education, where he's clearly spent quite a lot of time and energy and, just sheer bloody-minded work compiling these documents. And yet he says, I'm not an etymologist. I'm a telecoms engineer. He is indeed a telecoms engineer. I did some more Googling. He works for Sony or Ericsson or one of these places.
Wow.
And he states in his academia profile, there's like a little CV section, and he basically says, yep, none of this is my kind of area of study, but I was doing some investigation into the similarities and differences between the Basque language and the Iberian language. Okay, so he has a lot of documents published on academia dealing with linguistics and linguistics-related topics. My academic background in this area is simply non-existent. This is what he says. So it was only by accident in 2009 when looking for evidences on the relationship between Basque and Iberian, a controversial issue. Oh, we all know how controversial that is.
Obviously.
That I classified Basque words in a way that made it clear to me that each phoneme had at least one specific meaning when the language was created. Actually, 1 or 2 pairs of opposed meanings in the case of consonants. As a consequence, I came to the conclusion that Basque was an artificial language built on a set of very clear rules long forgotten. I will add that, in my view, I also found evidence enough to prove that Basque and Iberian are closely related languages. Needless to say, at this stage, the scholars I communicated this discovery to did not show any interest in it. Now, what I'm hitting up against, I'm going to tell you a bit more about this work in a minute because it's cool, but... I'm a user of the internet, and I know that all the stuff that you find on the internet, as interesting as it may be, may or may not be terribly authoritative. And while I wish absolutely no disrespect to Mr. Villamor, who has clearly done a power of work on this topic, I don't really know how much authority he has within his studies. But man, it is interesting. So, if you take a look at any of his source code works, they're all kind of expansions on this concept. He has hypothesized that Proto-Indo-European roots have a code behind them, that each individual letter within the root has a defined and definable meaning. So, we've got plek, meaning to hit. This is the way that he's rendered that plaque Proto-Indo-European root. Right. So it's spelled here in this version. This is from Fernando Villamor's source code document. PLEH2K. Okay. And he translates this as meaning to hit. And he then further translates each phoneme thusly. P, meaning body. L, meaning internal, E, meaning active subject, H2, meaning spread, and K, meaning internal movement related presence. He goes on to say, the effect of the action is indicated as an internal extended presence. Rather than to hit, the meaning of this pi root seems to be physical wound, disease, which then gives us words like Latin plaga, blow or wound, and Greek apoplexy and paraplegia, both of which were mentioned as cognates in the etymon line entry.
Yeah.
I really, really, really want all pi words to have a secret code within them.
Yeah.
And if you do too, look this guy up. He has, so the different source code documents, there's 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, I think it goes to 2.5. And most of those individual volumes have between 1,500 and 2,500 pi roots that he has summarised, that he has deciphered, that he has translated into this particular sub-meaning that he has determined exists within the phonemes. Super interesting.
That is... the thing that I'm kind of struck by... what I want is I want to talk to Mark Sunderham about this specific thing.
Do you know, I was researching this in bed last night with the lights off. That makes it sound slightly salacious. I just mean I was looking at stuff on my phone while my husband was sleeping. And I found myself thinking, I wonder what time it is in Canada. I would love to hear what Mark Sunderham thinks about this.
Because I can kind of see
and yeah,
it,
this is exactly it. Like, you know, I'm very much in awe of this body of work. You know, whatever this body of work means in kind of wider etymological and linguistic circles, I'm very much in awe of it. But I would be very, very interested to hear what an academic, quote unquote, capital letter academic like Mark, what his thoughts would be on a body of work like this.
Yeah. If you are such a capital A academic and have run across this guy, please do email us, because now I really want to know, because I can see it being, it's got a kind of, I was going to mention a popular Dan Brown work, but the sooner we all stop talking about Dan Brown,
are you reading my mind over the internet?
But it does have a vaguely conspiratorial... When I picture this guy, I know it's anachronistic, but I picture, is it Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia standing in front of that big conspiracy board that the meme is? And I just picture that being the thing. And I remember...
It definitely feels like a linguistic conspiracy theory. But, I mean, like, guilty secret alert, I love conspiracy theories.
Oh, they're so much fun.
So much fun.
And it also vaguely reminds me of, like, the whole backronym
little
phenomenon.
Bit, yes. Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of go, I guess, but then you, again, like you say, you have that much work put into something, and it's like you got to at least admire the craft behind it, because that's a lot.
Yeah.
Wow. That's
wow. The good news is that all of this stuff is available through academia. You can download PDFs of each of these lengthy documents, looking at thousands of pi roots and decoding them according to this system that this man is kind of working from. And yeah, it's a little bit like an etymologist's Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, that's interesting. It was the thing that struck me that I found interesting was when you're talking about on the OED, you have like just pages and pages and pages of plague adjacent entries. And I just can't help but think, like, so for the benefit of listeners, because I don't think I'm going to be including all of our pre-words chat, because it just was long and rambling and we just talk for a bit. Because Amy and I are friends and we don't talk for a while between episodes sometimes. So we catch up a little
long
bit.
And rambling is definitely it's part of my shtick.
It wasn't technically off mic, but none of you will have heard it. So we were talking a little bit about the idea of this whole COVID-19 thing changing things, whether it will or won't, fundamentally or otherwise. And I kind of went, right, but so the plague, capital T, capital P, like that hit at a pretty important and sort of formative time in English. So it makes perfect sense that like this sort of epoch-defining moment would have this absolutely massive impact on the language. You know, like of course it becomes the common reference point, and possibly the first common reference point that number of people would have had. You know, the ultimate kind of flashbulb moment where it's like, where were you when? It's like everyone has this common experience, possibly for the first time, maybe in history for that widespread a population. I don't know, but it just makes so much sense to me that English would have so many different uses and different figurative adaptations for the word plague when it had come through such an event, such a cataclysm, at a time when it was in its formative years as a language as well. Yeah. And so like that was something that was really kind of interesting to me. And I was like, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense because that's it was the first meme was plague, right? Because it's just this. Yeah,
but I mean, it's like just as you were saying, and again, this perhaps was before we kind of started, quote unquote, talking.
Yeah.
You know, if you talk about the plague, any good historian will say which one.
Yeah.
And any good historian will also be aware of the fact that we were talking about, you know, the victims of the plague. You know, whether you talk about Black Death outbreak number whatever in this year wherever. I'm such a stickler for details, am I not? But you know, the people involved in that event didn't know they were. I mean, they knew they were involved in a giant shitstorm, but they didn't have that sense of, oh God, this happened in, you know, Trieste and millions of people died, and you know, it's really interesting to me as someone who is, for the benefit of my mental health, having to step away from all the information that we currently have beamed into our brains about this situation. Yeah. It's really cool to think about people experiencing something like this without actually knowing what the fuck was going on.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us back to that, you know, very, very quickly, the word plague began to be associated with a divine striking.
Yeah.
In other words, in those times, I would imagine the only thing powerful enough to do something as terrible as this had to be God.
Yeah.
No one else could have that power.
Yeah. And there's a theological element to it. It's so rare that I get to use my degree in theology that I just have to kind of go, hey, I can say a thing. But it's interesting when you compare the way sort of a more modern interpretation of and spin on God versus sort of a medieval one or beyond, like just the Old Testament, New Testament dichotomy. There is just an acceptance of, if you believed in God, you're putting your belief in an entity that is incomprehensibly powerful. And therefore, if you've already accepted that, the fact that a thing happened, whether good or bad, that thing must have happened, was God did it. And it's a much more, there was a much more universal idea of faith that you bought into as a believer at these other points in history that isn't so much, we kind of have a tendency now to be like, okay, this one was from God, but this was something else. And there are reasons for reasonable theologians can argue both sides on that point. But in an earlier era, it wasn't that. It was just, like you say, it was like, well, there's only one thing that could have done this.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting. That was the other thing I was thinking of when you were talking about the idea that it was from had particularly a divine smiting element to it. Because really, what else can properly smite other than the divine? So it's... No,
I don't know, when I got to the third lead for the shiny microphone and it wouldn't work, I felt like I could do some smiting.
And you would have been righteously justified in your anger.
The great AV smiting of 2020.
I wanted to say...
It began in Scotland, but it spread like a plague.
Spread like a plague.
Yeah, so plague.
Plague. Very interesting. And very timely. That's good. I don't know what made you think of that, but it's that's good.
Some sort of divine inspiration.
Topical. Speaking of, we do want to say we got a lovely and sort of sad and worrying email from a longtime listener that I won't cite or name or read because it I haven't talked to this person about reading their email or identifying them, but basically just saying thanks, but that they were going through some tough times in the current crazy shit show that we are all muddling our way through. So I just wanted to say to everyone, if you are in those times, we are doing whatever it is that you do for other people from a distance to hope that they pull through it and that this thing leaves them more or less unscathed. And so we are thinking about all of you, dear listeners, because the fact that you're listening to us in these times is kind of humbling and weird.
Yeah,
the
for
idea
sure.
that people are still kind of bothering to listen in, and hopefully we can, because I know for me, when we say, and I think I can probably speak for you because you've said as much to me as well. Like, we get to these points where we like sit down to do this recording, and one or both of us is like, man, I don't want to do any of this today. And then we do it, and we get to the end, and we're like, that was good. That was helpful. So I mean,
Yeah,
I generally feel better after we have these little chats because it's a little, I don't know, window of normal nerdery in an otherwise very abnormal time. So hopefully we can all geek out for a little bit together.
Yeah, and like, you know, we were supposed to record this episode yesterday, and I was in one of those spaces where even the geekery couldn't help, and I didn't want to do anything, and I felt terrible, and I was a little bit worried about myself, and I you know, it's that whole, you know, whether it's depression with a capital D that you see your doctor about, or whether it's small depression of feeling bad that is perfectly fucking understandable given what's going on in the world right now. There's this really frustrating sense of all of these things that I could do right now would probably make me feel better, but I just can't do any of those things right now.
Yeah.
And it's like I had an extended period of time off work, maybe about 5 years ago, because I was depressed. And I remember thinking while I was at home during this period, you know, if you'd said to me 6 months ago that you wouldn't have to go to work for 3 months, whatever it was, I would have thought, oh man, I'm going to read so many books and I'm going to watch so many films and watch so much TV and do all these things the things that you wish you had the time to do that you never really have the time to get around to. And I'm finding right now, you know, we all have to stay at home. And there are still things out there that are taking up our time. And of course that differs from person to person and your commitments and your responsibilities and the job that you do and all that stuff. But I feel like I have a lot of time right now where I could be doing lots of really like excellent, cool, wonderful, self-improving things. But I also don't think there's anything wrong with saying we're living in a pretty scary time, and sometimes you just need to like be in your house and snuggle and
just eat the chips.
Just eat the chips and stay in bed and cancel that thing if you can, and look after yourselves, Lexitecturers. I think that there's, you know, we said earlier there's not really anything good about this situation. It's too big to kind of pull out platitudes, but I am really, really gratified by how people are not being terrible to each other. Yeah,
it's nice. And it's all well and good to have the memes where it's like, hey, Isaac Newton was laid off from his job and he discovered gravity. Sure. And it's like, well, that's great. for him. And maybe
Fuck
you
that
will.
guy.
And maybe you will learn a new language or learn to play the piano. Bill Murray learned to play the piano during Groundhog Day, which I think is the only actual moral of that story, is that anyone can learn the piano given enough time. But, maybe you won't. And maybe you'll sit and watch all of Star Trek Deep Space Nine and eat an ordinarily ill-advised number of cookies, but under the circumstances, a completely advised number of cookies. And then we get out the other side and figure stuff out then. But do what you got to do.
Yeah, do what you got to do, absolutely. And if what you got to do involves listening to us chumping about, speaking about words, then we are eternally grateful for that being the situation. And
Absolutely.
And we feel very, very humbled by the fact that you might choose to spend some of this time listening to us rambling on about words.
Yeah, it's quite cool. So thank you. Speaking of rambling about words, my word is farm.
Ooh.
And I don't actually remember. I think this was one of those ones where I was just like, I need a word. So I just did the thing where I just cast randomly around the dictionary until I find something that
I
seems
love lamp.
interesting. Yeah, exactly. I love lamp. And so what I found about farm was sort of interesting. It's fairly short, a little truth nugget, but it's the meaning of a chunk of land for the purposes of cultivation or agriculture. The earliest citation in the OED is 1523, but it has a question mark beside it, and I believe it's because, the citation is not super clear. It could be this meaning, or it could be the older meaning that I'm going to get to.
Okay.
But it's not clear that it was meant originally in this sense at that time. And the first non-question mark citation was 1556. But
Okay.
early 1500s, it started meaning a farm was a noun. It was a chunk of land. It was a chunk of land on which you grew things mostly for the purposes of food and feeding yourself and others. So, 1500s. The word itself dates back to the late 1200s. So it's a lot older. And it originally meant a fixed amount payable as rent, tax, fees, or some other such usage.
Ooh.
So a farm was basically, a chunk of money you paid to someone else for a thing. But a fixed chunk of money, your monthly rent, your quarterly taxes, whatever it was, that was your farm. And part of that was, when we use the phrase to farm out our services or something,
Okay.
that is an incredibly old idiom. Because that dates from the earliest uses of farm, because it originally meant to let or lease something out at a fixed price or a fixed rental fee.
That's super cool.
And so you would farm out your services, and that's nothing to do with land or growing. It predates the agriculture use of the word farm, which I found really kind of cool.
Yeah, that's
It's
really,
a very
really
resilient thing. And so the way this kind of came about is that, of course, in the that the system of governance and social organization, that for some reason, whenever I go to refer to it on this show, I forget what it's called. But
Do you mean
Lords-
feudalism?
Yes, thank you.
That's okay.
Jeez.
You got James Geary, I got feudalism. We're
Every
even.
time. God. So, yes, under the sense of feudalism, the best I
You
could
should
come
just
up
have a post-it note sitting above your computer that says,
I'm
it's
gonna
feudalism, damn it.
I'm just going to put feudalism on a post-it note and put it beside my... I'm going to do it. Is it feudalism you're thinking of, idiot? Because yes, it is, probably. So
It's
the
like
best I could
playing
do was
Jeopardy with
fiefdom.
yourself.
Yeah. The best I could do was fiefdoms, but that's not quite right. But anyway, under feudalism, as we know, the land was owned by landlords, shortened to just lords, because they're that important. And so the people doing the farming were not actually the landowners, so they would, the system developed where the farmer wouldn't own the land, but they would be both collecting a fee for the food they provided, but they would also be paying a fee in order to use the land for either subsistence farming or, later on sort of slightly commercial farming, etc.
Okay.
So the plot of land was intricately tied to the fact that you had to rent it out in order to work it as a farm. And so the the farm part was the money paid to get access to the land to grow your crops, and then it transitioned to be the land itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's how that transition kind of seems to have gone. You paid your farm.
This is almost like the opposite of how these things usually go.
Yeah.
Etymologically speaking, I mean.
Yeah. So you paid your farm to work the land, and then it became you worked the farm and went from there, which is kind of interesting. As far as etymology goes, it comes from the French. So ferme, Old French, meaning a rent or lease in the 1200s. And before that, it was from medieval Latin, firma, fixed payment, from the Latin firmare, which is a verb to meaning to fix, settle, confirm, or strengthen.
Firm and farm. Who
Yep.
knew?
And from firmus, meaning strong / stable, or figuratively constant or trustworthy, as an adjective. And then before that, it goes back to a pi root, meaning to hold firmly or to support. And that gives us, still sticking with that FRM, mostly with that FRM formation of cognates like affirm, confirm, firmament,
Oh, nice.
infirmary. And it gives us the word furl, which I guess I'd never really thought about, but I always thought that unfurl was one of those orphaned negatives where it, like ruthless, where we don't actually use ruth anymore.
Yeah, sure.
I always thought unfurl was just one of those, but furl, which makes sense because if you unfurl something, you must have furled it first in order to be able to unfurl it later. But that's where that comes from.
In my head, the only thing that is ever furled or unfurled is an umbrella. Presumably, it's possible to furl and unfurl other things, but it's
See,
always
I think
an
a
umbrella.
sail.
I'm not a seafaring type.
Oh, heavens, yeah. No, I wouldn't want to give anyone that impression, but
You sounded genuinely panicked there, like someone was going to
No,
approach
no.
you with a dinghy. Join us,
read-
Captain Ryan.
I have read about boats in books. So, yeah. And
Sorry,
so don't.
I'm just thinking about how it's nice to be able to take a little bit of information and seem like you know a lot about it, but also potentially dangerous.
Do not put me on a ship where I have to furl or unfurl anything. Disaster will befall us all. The other thing that comes from this pi root along a different branch is the word throne, which is from sort of the pi root gave us all those firms through Latin. Infirmary is another one on there that I don't know if I listed, but that's the Latin branch. The Greek branch went, and instead of like an FRM, it did sort of the THRM formation of it, and so it gives us throne, which makes sense. To hold firmly, to support, to uphold. And the original use of throne originally meant specifically seat of God or a saint in heaven.
Sorry.
And then it wasn't until the 1100s that it was applied to earthly sovereigns, because they went, I think
We're
I'm
sort of like
that.
gods.
Yeah, I think I'm like that. This is now my throne. Which is why, and you mentioned like the fact that I don't know what a pick is, plectrum or whatever, because I'm primarily a drummer, although it's not an excuse. I've been playing guitar since I was like 8, but I am primarily a drummer. But I have never once been even remotely comfortable with the fact that a drum stool, like if you actually look up a thing you sit on to play a drum set, that is called a throne.
No.
And it is the dumbest thing in the world, and I've never called it that because I am
Drum
deeply
throne.
uncomfortable calling it that.
Drum Throne sounds like a really, really shitty, greasy heavy metal band.
It
who
sure
I may have
does.
seen in the early 2000s.
Like,
Drum Throne!
I will go to their show, but I will not call it a throne.
That's so cool.
So yeah,
Game of
just
Drum Thrones.
A quick little jaunt down farm from something to support things to furling, unfurling sails to paying rent at a fixed rate to paying rent to grow crops on land to the land the crops are grown on itself. And there we go.
Is there any sense in your travels of when the original sense stopped being used? When was it kind of overtaken in the charts?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know that I actually noticed a specific...
I mean, it's hard to kind of pinpoint that with any great accuracy, I think, for any word, unless you happen to have a bizarre written source that kind of mentions that, which I believe, you do see that occasionally. But
yeah, sometimes you see someone going like, oh, it hasn't been since this that it was used this way or whatever.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Most of the time it just kind of stops and you're never sure what actually happened. But I'm not, I don't actually know. Like I think it was around the time that it because it became so ubiquitous as the the cultivated land use in the 1500s, but I mean, so the OED, when it talks about a fixed yearly sum accepted from a person as a composition for taxes or other monies which he is empowered to collect, it says obsolete except historical. So
okay,
in history books they talk about, there's a 1876 History of Norman Conquest book where he says the sheriff paid into the exchequer the fixed yearly sum which formed the farm of the shire. So it's like the historical use lasted, and the rent and farm use, or farm as rent use, seems to have, the last use that it has in the OED is in the end of the 1700s, but it seems like they get more and more spread out when you get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that it kind of gets like, those are still the last few instances of that are like general histories or books about the common laws of England, or catechisms and wills and inventories, like very technical manuals at that point. You don't get them in letters or inventories or normal kind of periodicals or anything at that point. It seems like after the 1500s it becomes a technical term that's still holding on, but it definitely seems like it doesn't seem like it was very long after it started meaning the land the food is grown on before it that kind of took over.
I feel like there is some fascinatingly super duper geeky research to be done here into history of agriculture and the linguist, like you say, the sense that and it's kind of the whole point of the History of English podcast, that the events of history shape our language. I feel like, not that it's not quite as foxy as the sort of history where people get their heads cut off, but people growing crops, and this the kind of the means by which they do that and the tools that they use, and there's a whole world out there in that one shift of meaning.
Yeah,
there's a whole history to be discovered, I suppose, if you knew the right places to look for it.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool.
That's super cool. I really love to farm out your services, because it's one of these idioms that I've kind of thought about before and thought, what the hell does that have to do with the place where the cows and the ducks come from?
Right, yeah.
But just never investigated it any further than that. So, yeah, now I know.
Yeah, it's actually even older, which is crazy.
That's awesome.
And that's it for another episode of Lexitecture. To get in touch with us about something you heard in this episode, you can email us at words@lexitecture.com. You can also follow along and talk to us at Lexitecture on Facebook and Twitter, and at Lexitecture Podcast on Instagram. For back episodes and the occasional blog post, visit us at Lexitecture.com. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon.